Alexander Chambers was born into a world that offered little solace, a bleak and uncaring environment that would come to define the man he eventually became. His childhood, spent in the dismal outskirts of Manchester, England, was marred by neglect, abuse, and a suffocating absence of love. From the moment he first opened his eyes, the cold, calculated cruelty of his surroundings became the only language he knew. The residents of his small, decaying terraced house recalled him as a quiet, withdrawn child with an unnerving gaze and a mind that was always scheming, always calculating. His father, Richard Chambers, a stern and emotionally unavailable figure, imposed a regimen of strict discipline that bordered on brutality. His mother, Margaret, whose own shattered hopes hovered like a ghost in every silent room, offered little in the way of comfort. In this grim environment, Alexander's formative years were consumed by an inward transformation that would later shape his destiny as a convicted murderer. As he grew into adolescence, Alexander's behavior became increasingly detached from the common experiences of youth. At school in central Manchester, he was neither friend nor foe to his peers, rather, he drifted on the outskirts of social circles, observing everyone with an emotionless detachment that unsettled teachers and parents alike. Teachers noted his exceptional academic abilities in literature and mathematics, but they also remarked on the chilling absence of empathy in his essays and classroom discussions. He writes with a precision that is almost clinical, devoid of any sentiment, recalled Mr. Harding, his literature teacher, in later interviews with the police. Such observations, although seemingly commendatory on the surface, masked the dark undercurrent of a young mind that was slowly preparing to commit acts that would shock the world. By the time he reached his early 20s, Alexander Chambers had already embarked on a life that largely defied societal norms. In the bustling streets of London, he assumed various transient identities, drifting through various jobs with a lack of commitment that belied an inner purpose. His early encounters with violence, initially in the form of petty vandalism and street brawls, quickly escalated into more ominous pursuits. Over the years, Alexander refined a methodology for eliminating those he deemed obstacles in his path. His crimes, always meticulously planned, were conducted in a manner that was as clinical as it was calculated, leaving behind traces of an individual who took meticulous care in ensuring that his acts of violence were measured and detached. It was during a particularly cold winter in 2005 that the municipality of New York City would first be introduced to the name Alexander Chambers. Under the perpetual gray skies of Manhattan, Alexander executed his first murder with an almost ritualistic precision that stunned even the most hardened detectives of the NYPD. His victim, a small-time criminal named Edward Miller, was carefully chosen not for personal vendetta but for his incidental role in a larger plan, one that Alexander believed was necessary to rid the world of corrupt influences. In the dead of night, on a desolate street where flickering neon lights failed to mask the grim reality of urban decay, Alexander confronted Edward with a single-minded determination. "Your existence is a stain on society," he had whispered in a voice as cold as the winter wind, and with that, he carried out his ominous deed in a manner that was devoid of any visible emotion. The following months were characterized by a series of events that further cemented Alexander's reputation as a man driven by a singular, inhuman logic. In Boston, Massachusetts, an environment that prided itself on a blend of historic charm and modern rigor, another incident unfolded. His next victim, a business magnate named Robert Sullivan, was believed to be corrupt and responsible for the economic exploitation of vulnerable communities. Alexander's meticulously planned intrusion into Sullivan's upscale townhouse on Beacon Street was executed with a precision that left forensic investigators both baffled and perturbed. The conversations between law enforcement officials and forensic experts would later reveal the calculated nature of his actions. The killer left no room for error. There was an eerie detachment in his work, as if he were operating on a plane beyond human emotion, stated Detective Laura Kensington, whose calm, methodical approach to the investigation was in stark contrast to the chaos his crimes induced. Despite these high-profile acts in the United States, Alexander Chambers' journey back in time was one marked by constant self-reflection and an unyielding desire to master the art of elimination. His recollections of a childhood filled with emotional abandonment and cruelty were chronicled in his own silent memoirs, a personal narrative that he never published but spoke of quietly during rare conversations with those few who managed to break through his isolation. "I was never given a chance to feel," he once remarked during an interview with a struggling journalist in a secluded cafe in Edinburgh. "In the absence of warmth, I found solace in logic and order. Emotions are a hindrance in the quest for truth." Such sentiments painted a picture of a man who was as self-aware as he was remorseless, a cold intellect sharpened by years of introspection and lived pain. His trial, when it finally came, was an event watched with morbid fascination around the globe. Held in a state-of-the-art courtroom in Chicago, the trial of Alexander Chambers was as much a psychological dissection as it was a legal proceeding. Prosecution testimonies detailed events spanning decades, linking a series of seemingly unrelated murders to a single, ruthless mind. Among those who took the stand was Dr. Emily Richardson, a renowned forensic psychologist who had spent months poring over Alexander's early writings and personal records. "What we witnessed in his actions was not the ferocity of a madman, but the calculated precision of a clinical surgeon," Dr. Richardson explained in a measured tone that resonated through the courtroom. Her analysis, coupled with painstaking evidence collected from numerous crime scenes, painted a portrait of a man who transcended conventional criminality by embracing a philosophy of morality twisted beyond recognition. In the days following his conviction, Alexander Chambers was transferred to a maximum security prison facility in upstate New York. The prison, a labyrinth of sterile corridors and fortified walls, served as the final stage for a man who had long since abandoned the possibility of redemption. Here, in a cold cell with little more than a metal cot and a small barred window that offered a glimpse of a gray, indifferent sky, Alexander spent his days revisiting the memories that had shaped him. In whispered monologues to the silent room, he recounted the long-ago moments of neglect and humiliation, a childhood spent in the shadows of a broken family, an adolescence in which he found solace only in the cold embrace of solitude. "I was forged in the crucible of indifference," he once murmured during a rare interview with prison psychologists. "Every rejection, every slight, every moment of despair became the building blocks of who I am." Within the confines of his cell, Alexander's interactions with fellow inmates were minimal. However, on occasion, conversations would spark between him and others whose lives had also been marred by tragedy and criminality. One such inmate was Gregory Miles, a man known for his volatile temper and haunted past in Birmingham. During one particularly tense evening in the visitation room, Gregory ventured, "You speak as if you understand pain better than anyone. Is it true that you never felt love?" Alexander's reply was measured and devoid of pity: "Love is a human construct designed to impede logical decision-making. I have felt only what was necessary." The exchange, brief as it was, left those present with an unsettling impression, a glimpse into a mind that had long since reconciled cruelty with a disturbingly rational detachment. The forensic records which meticulously documented all of Alexander's crimes revealed a man who moved with the precision of a clockwork automaton. His methods were clinical, his preparations exhaustive, and his execution flawless. In one instance, evidence collected from his crime scene in Los Angeles, where he eliminated a corrupt city official implicated in widespread bribery schemes, showed that Alexander had not left a single trace of his presence. The medical examiner's report described injuries that were as systematic as they were lethal, outlining each step of the procedure with an almost scientific accuracy. It was as if he dissected his victim before the actual act of violence, ensuring that every move was calculated and irreversible. Commented Dr. Anthony Weiss, a forensic pathologist who painstakingly reviewed the evidence. The language he used was clinical and precise, a reflection of the stark, emotionless quality that had come to characterize Alexander Chambers. Even as legal experts, law enforcement, and the media attempted to delve into the enigma that was Alexander Chambers, there remained an undercurrent of discussion surrounding the origins of his harrowing detachment. His early years, chronicled in court documents and carefully preserved unpublished journals, revealed an evolution from a suffering child to a man who embraced a lifestyle defined by deliberate cruelty. His writings detailed days of isolation in the squalid back alleys of Manchester and nights spent wandering the rain-soaked streets, seeking solace in the indifferent rhythm of urban decay. "I remember the unforgiving cold of winter and the relentless sound of empty footsteps," he once wrote in a journal entry that was discovered during a subsequent search of his belongings. "It was in those moments of utter desolation that I understood the true nature of existence, a ceaseless cycle of neglect and retribution." Such passages, though artfully composed, served as a grim reminder that the seeds of his later actions had been sown long before he stepped over the threshold of morality. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, there were moments during the trial when Alexander's calm introspection edged dangerously close to a disturbing sort of revelation. In one of the final sessions, as the prosecution laid out a timeline of his sins, Alexander was asked about the nature of remorse. In a voice that was both eerie and detached, he stated, "Remorse is a luxury one cannot afford when every calculation, every move, is undertaken in the pursuit of an unyielding truth. I see the world as it is a series of equations, each outcome predetermined by the circumstances of birth and fate." His words, though delivered in a tone void of any deep-seated emotion, resonated with a chilling logic that left many questioning the very nature of free will and morality. The media frenzy surrounding his case was relentless. Interviews with former acquaintances, neighbors, and those in positions of authority painted a patchwork portrait of a man whose outward demeanor belied an inner complexity. Elizabeth Turner, a retired social worker from Manchester, recalled, "Even as a child, Alexander was different. There was an intensity in his eyes that made you wonder if he was seeing the world in a way no one else could ever grasp. But as he grew older, that intensity only morphed into something far more unsettling, a cold determination that seemed to justify his every action." Such eyewitness accounts, laced with incredulity and sorrow, added layers to the public's understanding of Alexander Chambers, a man who was as much a product of his environment as he was an architect of his own dark destiny. In the clinical corridors of the forensic laboratory, numerous experts attempted to piece together the psychological underpinnings of his behavior. Professor Jonathan Miles, a leading expert in criminal psychology from Oxford University, explained in a somber lecture, "When we examine the case of Alexander Chambers, it becomes clear that we are not dealing with a simple psychopath. We are confronted with an individual who has systematically deconstructed the emotional framework that binds most human beings. His actions are not driven by uncontrollable rage but by an intellectual detachment, an almost scientific assessment of life's variables." His discourse, though imbued with academic detachment, underscored the chilling reality that Alexander's crimes were committed not out of impulsivity, but from a deep-seated belief that he was an inevitable force of nature, a harbinger of a new order shaped by logic and dispassion. Even in the midst of his incarceration, Alexander Chambers attempted to impose order on a chaotic system. He engaged in extensive correspondence with a select group of academics, legal experts, and even former police officers. In one of these letters, written from the confines of his cell in upstate New York, he detailed his internal philosophy: "Life is an unwritten ledger of events, and I have merely adjusted the columns to reflect my understanding of what must be rectified. My actions are not born out of malice, but from an unwavering commitment to a personal code of logic." The letter, while paradoxically poetic and clinical, served to further alienate him from the common definitions of remorse or penitence. Each sentence was carefully constructed, mirroring the dispassionate tone that had become his trademark. Outside the sterile walls of prison, debates over the nature of justice and retribution raged on. In academic circles, his case was studied as a rare phenomenon where genius and inhumanity intermingled, raising questions about the role of environment versus inherent disposition in the making of a killer. Dr. Samantha Reed, a renowned criminologist from Harvard University, noted during a televised symposium, "Alexander Chambers represents a convergence of factors: a childhood mired in neglect, a mind honed on the anvil of suffering, and an intellect that has chosen to operate entirely separate from what we consider normal human emotion." His case forces us to re-examine the boundaries of criminal intention and moral judgment. Her measured words, delivered against the backdrop of a modern lecture hall, evoked a sense of clinical detachment amidst impassioned debate. As the years passed and appeals were methodically exhausted, Alexander's reflections on his life grew even more intricate. In countless recorded sessions with prison-appointed psychologists, he delved repeatedly into the recesses of his past, scrutinizing every moment of isolation, every instance of neglect. In one such session, while discussing his earliest memories, he described in chilling detail the desolate streets of his childhood neighborhood in Manchester. The echoes of those days still resonate in my mind. Each broken window, every distant shout was a note in the symphony of my existence, he explained in a tone that oscillated between analytical observation and detached reminiscence. Over time, these sessions became less about rehabilitation and more about a confirmation of his lifelong conviction that emotions were hindrances to true understanding. There were moments when those who studied him questioned whether his actions, however abhorrent, might be understood in the context of a mind fundamentally altered by early trauma. His early interactions with a local youth mentor, Thomas Green, still recalled by some former colleagues, represented a rare attempt to bridge the gap between a lost child and the man he became. Thomas had once tried to introduce Alexander to literature and art as means of channeling his inner turbulence. I remember him once telling me that Shakespeare spoke of the darkness within mankind with a sincerity that no other writer could match, Thomas later recounted in an interview with a local newspaper in Manchester. Yet even as these small seeds of empathy were planted, they never blossomed. Instead, they were smothered by a pervasive disdain for anything resembling emotional vulnerability. For Alexander, feelings were anomalies in an otherwise orderly equation of existence. His legal defense, led by the shrewd attorney Richard Lawson from London, attempted to present an alternative narrative, a man broken by a system that failed him from the beginning. Lawson argued that the conditions of Alexander's upbringing had rendered him incapable of forming the emotional attachments that most take for granted, and thus, his actions were the product of an existence void of conventional morality. In a series of courtroom exchanges that were as stark as they were unyielding, Lawson maintained, "Your Honor, we must consider that this man is the product of a lifetime of deprivation and neglect, a man whose every action is the inevitable result of a broken childhood and a disintegrated family structure." Yet even as Lawson spoke with a semblance of empathy, the overwhelming evidence and clinical testimony from forensic experts ultimately rendered such appeals futile. In the wake of his sentencing in Chicago, the sterile announcements and legal formalities gave way to a prolonged period of silence, a silence that was only intermittently broken by the measured narrations in his personal journals. These journals, discovered during a later search of his cell, proved to be a chilling ledger of introspection and rationalization. One entry, dated long after his conviction, read, "I have grown to understand that every crime, every life taken, serves as a data point in the analysis of existence. In a world governed by chaos, my measured actions bring a form of order, a necessary correction in an otherwise imbalanced equation." The cold, methodical prose of these writings left little room for sympathy, instead offering only a window into a mind that had embraced a philosophy of the absolute, unyielding pursuit of what it regarded as a higher order of balance. On quiet nights, when the murmur of distant prison corridors was the only sound, Alexander would sometimes engage in philosophical discourse with the prison chaplain, Reverend Samuel Collins. These encounters, though infrequent, were marked by dialogues that were as stark as they were meticulously precise. "Reverend," Alexander once began, his voice devoid of any warmth, "if morality is but a construct, then is it not my duty to rewrite the rules that bind us?" The Reverend, taken aback by the clinical candor, responded cautiously, "But Alexander, laws exist to protect the innocent. How do you reconcile your actions with the pain you inflict?" To which Alexander replied, "Pain is merely a variable in the complex equation of life. Without the removal of harmful elements, can we truly speak of a balanced society?" Their conversations continued in this vein, leaving both participants with a lingering sense of disquiet that seemed to echo far beyond the cold walls of the cell. In the public sphere, debates about the nature of culpability and rehabilitation were fervent. Academic journals and legal digests published numerous articles scrutinizing every facet of Alexander Chambers' past and present. The consensus among many scholars was that his detachment, his relentless pursuit of a personal version of justice, was not so much a choice as it was an inevitability shaped by circumstances beyond his control. Yet, for every explanation offered, there remained a chilling gap, a void where human emotion should reside. His life, viewed through the lens of forensic analysis and psychological evaluation, emerged as an exhibition of precision and rationality untainted by any semblance of empathy. While most of society decried his actions as monstrous and irredeemable, there was always an undercurrent of academic curiosity. What drives a person to commit acts that are both meticulously premeditated and profoundly devoid of passion? In countless symposiums held in academic institutions in cities like Cambridge and Edinburgh, scholars delved into the phenomena of criminal detachment. Alexander Chambers is not merely a murderer, observed Dr. Victor Langley during a panel discussion at the University of Edinburgh. He is a case study in the deconstruction of childhood, the systematic erosion of human compassion, and the unsettling possibility that under the right conditions, even the most kind-hearted soul might be transformed into an instrument of calculated destruction. Such analyses, though detached and scholarly, reverberated with a warning, that beneath the veneer of society's order lay the potential for ruin, nurtured by early suffering and guided by a relentless adherence to a logic beyond human empathy. Even within the realms of his confined existence, Alexander Chambers continued to reflect on the inexplicable dualities of life, the coexistence of brilliance and brutality, of order and chaos. Reports from prison psychologists detailed his routine of spending hours in silent contemplation, meticulously revisiting the memories of a childhood defined by stark inequalities and harsh realities. In one recorded session, he explained, "My earliest recollections are not of love or laughter, but of cold shadows, fractured voices, and a pervasive emptiness that taught me that affection is transient. In its place, I found only the clarity of purpose, a clarity that has guided every step I have taken." This introspection, delivered in a tone that was as clinical as it was resolute, underscored an undeniable truth: the man before them had long stopped searching for redemption, choosing instead to embrace a destiny forged in the crucible of hardship. In the months following his incarceration and subsequent trial, Alexander's writings and recorded conversations became the subject of intense research. Historians and criminologists pored over every detail, trying to reconcile the cruelty of his actions with the tragic narrative of a man who had been robbed of normal human experiences. His interactions with his few confidants, a reclusive cellmate named Martin, and an aging counselor, Dr. Helen Pierce, provided sparse insights into a mind wherein every emotion had been catalogued, examined, and then rendered obsolete in the face of a methodical drive toward what he saw as necessary retribution. In hushed tones during a mediated interview, Dr. Pierce observed, "When I listened to Alexander describe his past, I could hear not the echoes of childhood terror alone, but also the quiet resignation of a man who knew that to feel was to falter." His was a life governed by an arithmetic of suffering and survival. Outside the prison grounds, the societal debate continued unabated. Journalists from around the world sought to interview those closest to him, attempting to humanize a killer whose deeds had transformed him into an almost mythic figure, a cautionary emblem of what could result when a dangerous cocktail of neglect and rationality collides. In a rare televised segment broadcast from Washington, D.C., a panel of legal experts argued passionately over the ethics of preserving his writings as a case study. "There is a fine line between understanding and glorification," warned attorney Mary Collins. "We must ensure that in our academic curiosity, we do not inadvertently offer succor to those who might see his philosophy as a blueprint for their own actions." Her words, delivered with a measured gravity, resonated against a backdrop of mounting public anxiety concerning the broader implications of Alexander Chambers' life and legacy. Yet, regardless of the intense scrutiny, Alexander's narrative remained profoundly unyielding. His detailed accounts of each crime, his unvarnished recollections of a childhood that knew nothing but cold dismissals, and his methodical tone in recounting every event coalesced into a narrative of clinical inevitability. The forensic records, the painstaking reconstructions of crime scenes from New York to Los Angeles, and the emotional distance he maintained even in private discourse all painted a picture of a man who had rejected the frailties of human sentiment in favor of an unrelenting dedication to a personal code that was as ruthless as it was systematic. Over time, as the echoes of his judicial proceedings faded into a somber footnote in the annals of crime, scholars and casual observers alike were left with lingering questions that defied easy answers. What does it mean to be human when all the warmth has been methodically excised from one's soul? Can the meticulous logic that governed Alexander Chambers' every move ever hope to be reconciled with the chaotic, messy tapestry of human emotion? In quiet moments of reflection, both within academic treatises and in intimate interviews with those who once knew him, the cold answer remained the same: the capacity for violence, when honed by the bitter experiences of a broken childhood, is a force as inevitable as it is indifferent. In his final days within the institutional confines of the maximum security prison, Alexander's presence remained as enigmatic as ever, a figure both loathed and studied, a man whose life served as a grim commentary on the intersections of environment, intellect, and morality. His legacy, preserved in clinical case studies and morbid retellings, endures not only as a cautionary tale but also as a stark reminder of the perils inherent in a society that can so easily let a troubled mind slip through its cracks. In the sterile silence of his cell, with only the distant echoes of interrogations and academic debates to keep him company, Alexander Chambers continued to embody the chilling truth that some lives, however early tarnished by neglect, can evolve into instruments of calculated destruction. Today, as law enforcement archives, academic journals, and forensic reports interlace to form the mosaic of his history, Alexander's story remains a subject of relentless inquiry and exemplar of the cold arithmetic of a mind honed in suffering. His detailed recollections of the bleak corridors of his childhood, the clinical execution of each crime, and the interminable suppression of the very human emotions that others take for granted all serve to reinforce a disquieting reality: the capacity for cruelty can be nurtured as much by circumstance as by intent. Every recorded testimony, every carefully preserved journal entry, stands as evidence to what one man believes is the only logical course of action in a world that, to him, has always been defined by its inherent flaws and imbalances. As this extensive examination of Alexander Chambers' life draws to a close, it is imperative to note that the narrative presented here is a work of pure fiction. The detailed explorations of his early childhood, the exacting recounting of his crimes, the measured dialogues, and the unyielding clinical tone are all elements crafted for this fictional account. While the settings and names are rooted in real geographic places and familiar English identities, the entire story remains an entirely fictional tale and is not based on actual events. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to my channel, like, and check the description to find out how you can support my work.